Many people assume that a spiritual awakening will lead to boundless energy, purpose, and motivation. But what if the opposite happens? What if, instead of feeling enlightened, you feel lost, detached, and strangely unmotivated? Carl Jung understood this paradox deeply. He saw spiritual awakening not as the end of the journey, but the painful beginning of true self-confrontation. In this video, we'll explore why awakening often leaves you feeling empty, and how this emptiness might be the most important part of your transformation. When a person experiences a spiritual awakening, something profound and unsettling begins to unfold within them. It's often described as a moment of clarity, a flash of divine insight, or a deep connection to something greater than the self. But what happens next is rarely talked about: the slow, disorienting collapse of everything that once held meaning. The individual begins to see that the identity they've spent years constructing, their beliefs, ambitions, social roles, and even moral ideals, was largely built upon the expectations of others and the unconscious programming of society. Carl Jung referred to this constructed identity as the persona, the mask we wear to function in the world. It is who we pretend to be, not who we truly are. The persona is useful, even necessary, for social survival. But after a spiritual awakening, this mask begins to crack. What once felt natural, pursuing career goals, maintaining a certain social image, following cultural norms, now feels artificial, even absurd. There is a growing sense that something false is falling away, and what remains is nothing. Just silence. This is what Jung called the ego death, though he didn't use the term in the psychedelic or mystical sense it's often used today. For Jung, this was the psychological death of the false self, a painful process that strips the soul bare. It's like the floor beneath your feet suddenly disappears. You no longer know who you are, what you want, or why you're here. The stories you once told yourself about your life no longer make sense. You can't go back to being who you were, but you don't yet know who you are becoming. This gap, the space between the old self and the emerging true self, is what causes the collapse in motivation. Before awakening, your life may have been driven by unconscious goals, achievement, recognition, power, or even spiritual superiority. You may have believed that if you just worked hard enough, or found the right philosophy, or meditated long enough, you'd reach some final state of peace. But spiritual awakening doesn't give you that. It takes everything away. It reveals that much of what you were striving for was never truly yours to begin with. You were playing roles, following scripts written by family, culture, religion, or trauma. This realization is devastating. It's like waking up in a theater, realizing the show is over and the actors, including you, have all walked off stage. What's left is a vast, silent emptiness. And in that emptiness, motivation disappears. Not because you're lazy or broken, but because the tools that once drove you no longer function. You've outgrown them. The motivational systems of the ego, fear of failure, hunger for success, desire for praise, no longer hold the same power. They lose their grip. Jung warned that this stage can be psychologically dangerous. Without guidance, it's easy to mistake this collapse for depression, to feel like something has gone terribly wrong. But from a Jungian perspective, this is not a breakdown. It's a breakthrough, a dismantling of the old so that the true self, what Jung called the self with a capital S, can slowly emerge. The ego, terrified of its own disintegration, will often try to rebuild the old identity in panic. It will tempt you to go back, chase old dreams, reattach to toxic relationships, or pick up abandoned ambitions just to feel stable again. But deep down, you know these things no longer fit. They're echoes of a former life. So here you are, in the rubble of who you once were. You look around and see no clear direction, no fiery motivation, no external validation. This is not a failure. It is the sacred pause. The space in which the soul begins its slow reorientation. Jung compared this process to alchemy, the nigredo, or blackening phase, where all that was impure is burned away. It is a necessary darkness, one that precedes rebirth. To go through this collapse with awareness is to walk the path of individuation, the lifelong journey toward wholeness. It is not glamorous, it is not easy, and it will not give you quick answers. But it will give you something far more valuable, the chance to meet yourself, perhaps for the first time. That is why you have no motivation after awakening. Because you are no longer moving from the surface, you are being called from the depths. And that voice, still faint, is waiting for you to listen. After the spiritual awakening, once the initial wave of insight has passed and the illusions have shattered, many find themselves surrounded not by light, but by emptiness. This comes as a shock. Shouldn't awakening feel blissful? Shouldn't it come with clarity, purpose, and joy? Instead, it often feels like being cast out into a desert, silent, vast, and directionless. The world no longer holds the same color, and the inner fire that once pushed you to act has flickered out. You are awake, yes, but you feel more lost than ever. Carl Jung understood this feeling intimately. He believed that awakening was not a peak experience to be chased, but a threshold, a rupture in the psyche that exposes the raw truth of the self. And after crossing that threshold, the old world dies. Along with it dies the personality you once relied on, the passions you once clung to, and the dreams that used to light your path. What's left is not a new dream, at least not right away, but a void, a psychological emptiness that can feel unbearable. Jung described this as the confrontation with the unconscious. The conscious mind, once full of plans, goals, and distractions, is now forced to turn inward. But the inward journey is not always filled with visions and insights. Sometimes it is filled with silence, profound, uncomfortable silence. In this silence, you come face to face with your own inner nothingness. You realize that beneath all your striving, you don't actually know who you are. You don't know what you want. And worse, nothing seems to matter anymore. This is not laziness, it is not apathy, it is a sacred form of disorientation, a necessary emptiness. Jung likened this to a kind of spiritual dehydration. You are parched not because something is wrong with you, but because your soul is no longer being fed by the surface-level motivations of the ego. You are starving for something deeper, but you don't yet know what that is. The problem is, in modern culture, we are taught to fear emptiness. We fill it with noise, productivity, entertainment, relationships, and endless scrolling. So when a spiritual awakening forcibly removes those distractions, what remains can feel unbearable. We interpret this void as failure. We panic. We ask, what happened to me? Why don't I care anymore? But Jung would say that this emptiness is not the end of the journey. It is the fertile soil of something new. Imagine uprooting a tree. You tear it from the ground, and for a time, there is just a hole. That is what the spiritual void feels like. A deep cavity inside the soul. The temptation is to fill it quickly, jump into a new belief system, chase a new mission, grasp for instant meaning. But true transformation requires that we sit in the emptiness, that we listen to it, that we resist the urge to distract ourselves from it. In alchemical terms, this stage is the nigredo, or blackening. It is a time of decay, decomposition, and inward collapse. But it is also the first step in the creation of gold. Without the blackening, no rebirth is possible. Jung saw this stage not as a crisis, but as an invitation, a chance to let the false parts of ourselves rot away so that something true can be born. During this phase, your energy will be low, your motivation will vanish. You may even find it difficult to get out of bed. This is not a sign of spiritual weakness, but of spiritual realignment. The ego is no longer in control. The old motivations, pleasing others, achieving status, building an image, have been seen through. And so the system stalls. The psyche needs time to reset. It needs silence, stillness, and space. The danger, Jung warned, is in trying to escape the void too soon. If you fill it prematurely, with new obsessions, new identities, or shallow positivity, you risk returning to the very illusions your awakening tried to dissolve. But if you can stay, if you can endure the silence, something remarkable begins to happen. You begin to hear faint whispers from the unconscious. Not commands, not goals, just subtle feelings, archetypal images, and fragments of intuition. These are the seeds of a new inner life. In this empty space, your soul begins to reorient itself, not toward success, but toward meaning. Not toward external stimulation, but toward inner truth. But this process cannot be rushed. The void is not a mistake. It is the womb of transformation. The dark cave where the new self gestates in silence. And so you wait. You rest. You listen. And slowly, imperceptibly, a different kind of energy begins to rise. one not rooted in ambition, but in authenticity. But for now, you remain in the in-between, the liminal space where the old no longer holds and the new has not yet arrived. This is the sacred emptiness after awakening. It is the space where your soul breathes unburdened for the first time. And though it may feel like nothing is happening, Jung would remind you, this emptiness is the process. It is the beginning of a new kind of life, one that does not come from the outside, but from the deep, silent truth within. One of the most unsettling aspects of a spiritual awakening is the realization that your old motivations, those things that once got you out of bed in the morning, no longer move you. The desire for money, status, romantic attention, career success, even personal development, they start to feel hollow. You may still intellectually understand their value, but something deep within you has shifted. You can no longer believe in them the way you once did. And so, even when you try to go through the motions, go to work, pursue goals, improve yourself, it all feels strangely lifeless. The drive is gone. You ask yourself, what's wrong with me? But Carl Jung would say, nothing is wrong. In fact, this is exactly what should be happening. Before awakening, most of our motivation is rooted in the ego. The ego thrives on structure, on identity, on external markers of success. It motivates us with stories of who we are, who we should become, and what we must do to be worthy of love or respect. These stories are not inherently bad. In fact, they're often necessary to navigate the early stages of life, but they're rarely our own. They're inherited from our parents, absorbed from society, or shaped by unresolved trauma. They become internal scripts we follow without even realizing it. For example, you may have grown up believing that your value comes from being the high achiever, the responsible one, the caretaker, the rebel, or the smart one. These roles push you forward in life. They give you purpose, but they also trap you. Jung referred to these unconscious roles and patterns as complexes, autonomous parts of the psyche that operate below the surface, driving your behavior without your conscious awareness. Spiritual awakening begins to disrupt these complexes. You start to see them, not just intellectually, but experientially. The illusion of identity is pierced. You realize that your career ambition was never really about passion, it was about earning your father's approval, or that your perfectionism wasn't a sign of self-discipline, but a mask to hide your fear of rejection. This kind of insight shatters the illusion of free will. It's painful, but freeing. You're no longer a puppet of your unconscious patterns, but you're also not sure who you are without them. That's where the collapse of motivation comes in. The ego is disoriented. Its entire motivational framework, built on fear, desire, status, validation, is no longer compelling. You see through it. And because your deeper self, the self in Jungian terms, has not yet fully emerged, there's nothing to replace it. The result is a kind of psychological limbo. You're no longer seduced by the old goals, but you haven't yet discovered the new ones. This is terrifying. Our culture idolizes productivity and forward motion. We're taught that if we're not striving for something, we're wasting our lives. So when your internal engine suddenly cuts out, it can feel like a personal failure. But Jung would argue the opposite. This loss of ego-based motivation is a necessary stage of individuation, the process of becoming your true self. Individuation cannot happen while you're still hypnotized by borrowed desires. The ego must be dethroned, not destroyed but humbled, brought into right relationship with the deeper psyche. There's another reason your old motivations no longer work. You no longer believe in the same definition of success. Success used to mean control, mastery, image, and accumulation. Now, after awakening, success begins to look more like integration, wholeness, inner harmony, but those values are harder to measure. They can't be tracked with numbers, trophies, or applause. They require stillness, reflection, and patience, qualities the ego resists. During this phase, you might find yourself questioning everything. Why am I in this job? Why am I in this relationship? Why do I post on social media? Why do I keep pushing myself when I no longer care? These questions are uncomfortable, but they signal growth. They mean you're shedding the false layers, peeling back the psychic armor you've worn your whole life, and underneath that armor is a soul that doesn't want to be successful. It wants to be real. The absence of motivation is not a void to be feared, but a recalibration. Your system is rewiring. It's letting go of the cheap fuel of ego and preparing to run on a different kind of energy. An inner fire that arises not from pressure or fear, but from alignment with your deeper purpose. This new motivation doesn't come all at once. It emerges slowly and often in unfamiliar ways. You may be drawn to solitude, to creativity, to nature, to acts of service, or to inner exploration. These impulses may not make sense to the logical mind, but they feel right, as if some deeper intelligence is guiding you. Jung believed that the self, the totality of who you are, including the conscious and unconscious, knows your path even when you do not. When the ego steps aside, the self begins to steer, but it does so subtly, quietly, through intuition, dreams, synchronicities, and sudden moments of clarity. The ego expects a 5-year plan. The self offers you a single step. So if you find yourself unmotivated after awakening, take heart. You are not broken. You are not lazy. You are in the sacred process of rediscovering who you are, beyond the noise of the world. Your soul is learning to speak, and for the first time, you are learning how to listen. After the collapse of the ego and the disappearance of old motivations, many people assume that the worst is over. They believe that awakening should now bring peace, purpose, and inner light. But what often follows is something far more disturbing, a confrontation with the hidden aspects of the self, the parts you've denied, rejected, or never even knew existed. This is the beginning of what Carl Jung called shadow work, and it is perhaps the most misunderstood and avoided stage of spiritual awakening. The shadow, as Jung described it, is the unconscious part of the psyche that contains everything the ego refuses to identify with. It holds our fears, shame, desires, selfishness, anger, envy, and unresolved trauma. But it also holds repressed creativity, power, and emotional truth. Over the course of a lifetime, we build a socially acceptable self-image by pushing certain aspects of ourselves into this shadow. We say, "I'm not angry," or "I'm not weak," or "I'm not needy." But the psyche doesn't erase what we repress, it just hides it, and what's hidden begins to control us from the dark. Before awakening, the shadow operates quietly, influencing our behavior without our knowledge. It shows up in our projections, when we judge others harshly, overreact emotionally, or feel an irrational dislike for someone. It also shows up in our addictions, compulsions, and self-sabotaging habits. But we rarely question it because our ego maintains the illusion of control. We believe we are good, or in control, or on the right path. We protect the image of ourselves we want to believe in. Spiritual awakening cracks that image wide open. It doesn't just reveal the divine, it also exposes the demons. And when the surface collapses, the unconscious begins to rise. Suddenly, you're faced with feelings and impulses you can't explain, bursts of rage, waves of grief, paralyzing fear, shame you thought you buried decades ago. This is the shadow coming to light, and it's terrifying. Many people try to escape at this point, retreating into distraction, denial, or premature spiritual bypassing. They seek comfort in positive thinking, affirmations, or new spiritual identities that ironically become new masks for the ego. But Jung was clear. The only way out is through. Shadow work is not a one-time event. It is a lifelong process of radical self-honesty. It demands that you sit with your discomfort, face your contradictions, and take responsibility for the parts of you that are not kind, wise, or noble. It's not about destroying the shadow, it's about integrating it. The shadow is not evil, it is merely unconscious, and as Jung famously said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is why your lack of motivation may persist even after awakening. Your psyche is no longer driven by shallow rewards, but it's not yet free from internal resistance. Shadow work brings this resistance to the surface. You may feel paralyzed by old wounds, haunted by past mistakes, or overwhelmed by guilt. You may uncover parts of yourself that sabotage your efforts, whisper doubts, or tell you that you're not worthy of healing. These voices are not signs of failure. They are cries for attention from forgotten parts of your soul. Doing this work is like entering a dark cave with only a flickering candle. It's frightening, but necessary. You might feel like you're losing your mind, but what you're actually losing is your illusion. The more you face the shadow, the more whole you become. And wholeness, not perfection, is the goal of Jungian psychology. The self, the integrated, fully realized being you are meant to become, includes both light and dark. To become whole is to accept your complexity, your contradictions, and your humanity. In practical terms, shadow work can take many forms. It might involve journaling, dream analysis, therapy, meditation, or creative expression. It often arises through relationships, especially those that trigger strong emotional reactions. What frustrates you in others often points to disowned aspects of yourself. Each trigger is an invitation to look inward. Each uncomfortable feeling is a doorway into deeper understanding. But shadow work is not just internal, it also changes how you live. As you reclaim your power from the unconscious, you begin to act with more authenticity. You stop needing to impress or manipulate others. You stop chasing validation. You become more honest with yourself and the world. And strangely, as you embrace your flaws and wounds, you become more compassionate. You stop projecting your pain onto others. You realize that everyone carries a shadow, and that realization softens you. It humbles you. It makes you real. This is the paradox of awakening. The deeper you go into your darkness, the more light you bring to the world. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The path to true transformation is not up and out, it is down and in, into the places you fear, the memories you buried, and the truths you denied. And when you do this work, when you walk into the cave, you begin to notice something incredible. The void that once felt so empty starts to feel alive. The stillness becomes sacred. You begin to hear the voice of your deeper self, not loud but clear, not commanding but truthful. You feel the stirrings of a new kind of motivation, one rooted not in ego but in soul. One that says, now you know who you are, now you are ready to live. After you've faced the collapse of the ego, sat through the silence of emptiness, and wrestled with the darkness of the shadow, something unexpected begins to happen. Not all at once, and not with fireworks or fanfare, but slowly, subtly, like the first breath after a long night of drowning. A new kind of energy starts to stir inside you. It is quiet, gentle, and yet it feels more real than anything you've ever known. This is not the return of your old motivation. This is something entirely different. It is the emergence of authentic purpose. Up until now, your life may have been driven by ideas imposed from the outside, by society's definitions of success, by your family's expectations, or by the unconscious needs of your ego. But now, those motivations no longer move you. You've seen through them. You've felt their emptiness. And in their absence, a space has opened up, an inner clearing, like a forest floor after a fire. At first, it may still feel barren, but then, almost imperceptibly, the first signs of new life appear, a thought that inspires you, a strange new interest, a gentle pull towards something that doesn't make sense on paper but feels undeniably right. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the journey toward becoming who you truly are, not who you were taught to be, not who you pretended to be, but who you were always meant to be. Individuation is not about self-improvement, it's about self-realization. It is the process by which your unique psychological blueprint, the self, begins to express itself in the world. And with it comes a new fire. A fire that doesn't roar, but glows steadily. It doesn't come from fear or desire or the need to prove anything. It comes from alignment. You no longer need to chase motivation. You begin to listen for it. It doesn't demand or pressure you. It invites you. It speaks in symbols, images, intuitions, synchronicities. You feel it when you're doing something that feels meaningful, even if no one else notices. You feel it when you're creating, helping, learning, or simply being still. This motivation doesn't come from what the world wants from you. It comes from what your soul longs to express. For some, this new purpose might take the form of art. For others, it might be in teaching, healing, working with nature, or building community. It doesn't have to be dramatic. In fact, it often isn't. It may look ordinary from the outside, but to you, it feels sacred. There's a sense that your life is now connected to something larger than yourself. Not in a dogmatic way, but in a living, breathing way. You may not be able to explain why you're doing what you're doing, but you know, deep down, that it's true. This new fire also changes your relationship with discipline and effort. Before, you may have forced yourself to work, driven by anxiety or ambition. Now, the effort flows from within. You're not pushing, you're being pulled. And though the work may still be challenging, it doesn't drain you the way it used to. In fact, it nourishes you. Because you're not pretending anymore, you're not wearing a mask. You're acting in harmony with your deeper nature. Of course, this doesn't mean life becomes easy or pain-free. You'll still face doubt, hardship, and confusion, but your suffering will be different. It will be part of the process, not a sign that you're off track. Jung taught that a meaningful life is not one free from struggle, but one in which the struggle serves a purpose. And when you're living from the self, even your pain begins to feel meaningful. It becomes a form of transformation, not punishment. You may also notice a shift in how you relate to others. You stop trying to impress or convince people. You're less reactive, less defensive. You're no longer invested in the persona you used to project. You're more interested in truth than performance. And paradoxically, this makes your presence more powerful. People feel it. They may not know what's changed, but they sense something real. You're grounded. You're centered. You're alive in a way that defies explanation. This new way of being doesn't eliminate the ego, but it puts it in its proper place. The ego becomes a servant of the self rather than its master. You use your skills and talents not to build an identity, but to fulfill a calling. And even if that calling shifts and evolves over time, the inner orientation remains the same. You are no longer looking outside for validation. You are looking within for guidance. Eventually, what was once a flickering light becomes a steady flame. You begin to trust yourself, not the surface-level self, but the deeper, quieter self that's been guiding you all along. You stop asking, "What should I do to succeed?" and start asking, "What am I here to give?" That's when true motivation returns, not as pressure or anxiety, but as a sense of inner necessity. You're not chasing the world, you're expressing your soul, and that is the most powerful force of all. In the end, you come to realize that the emptiness you feared was not a void, but a womb. It was the space where your false self dissolved and your true self was born. And in that birth, you didn't just rediscover motivation, you discovered meaning, not given to you by the world, but grown from within. And once you've tasted that, you can never go back. You wouldn't want to, because now, at last, your life is your own.